Good evening. We hereby call the Wednesday, March 16th, 2022 meeting of the Boulder City Planning Commission to order. We'll start with a confirmation of posting and roll call. The agenda and package have been posted on our website, and as far as a roll call, we're missing Beth Benar. However, Steve Rudd and Ernest Biaski are at the attending the meeting via telephone. With that, we'll move to the Pledge of Allegiance. If everyone would just stand and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. That moves us to the musical interlude, followed immediately by the public comment. This is an initial public comment. If anyone has any comments on issues to be discussed here tonight, please call in now. The call-in number is 702-589-9629. And since this meeting has the streaming has a delay, we'll wait 45 seconds until we resume. Hearing no comments, we'll move on to the agenda. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of the February 16th, 2022 meeting. Does anyone have any comments, corrections to the minutes? Does anyone have a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you.
A second.
Thank you very much. Let's take a vote on approving the minutes. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So signify. Okay, the minutes are approved. So this meeting, just by way of a little bit of background for the public, this meeting, there were no action items from the community on this meeting, and so this meeting will be dedicated to a training session for the Planning Commission. And with that, I'll turn it over to city staff.
Thank you, Chairman Matuska. As you recall, last month, the Planning Commission provided direction to staff on priorities for training for 2022. And the training opportunities that had the highest priority were related to variance criteria and Planning Commission procedural activities. And so staff has prepared presentations to respond to each of these. And we're going to start with a presentation by Ms. McKay regarding Planning Commission procedural activities, and then discuss variances.
Very good.
Good evening, Planning Commission members. I'm Tammy McKay, and I am your board secretary.
Tonight's training is just a brief overview of Robert's Rules of Order, and I'll begin by saying you mostly follow them very well, but I will provide the training. So Robert's Rules of Order is a manual of parliamentary procedures. It's a guide of basic rules for conducting meetings. It allows everyone an opportunity to be heard and to make decisions without confusion. Order of business on an agenda under Robert's Rules of Order is call meeting to order, roll call of members present, approval of the minutes of the last meeting, new business, and adjournment. And of course, you'll see public comment is not listed there because that's not a Robert's Rule of Order. That is a requirement of our Nevada open meeting law. Motions. The method used by members to express themselves is in the form of moving motions. A motion is a proposal that the entire committee can vote on. Individual members can make motions, second motions, debate motions, and vote on motions. How are motions presented? You need to obtain the floor. That means waiting until the last speaker has finished. Address the chair. Wait until the chair recognizes you. And then you can also divide the question. And I know we've done that in the past. Dividing a motion into two or more separate motions must be able to stand on their own. And we've done that before when we have matters pertaining to, and there's an A and a B. You can take each one separately. Making your motion. Speak in a clear and concise manner. Always state a motion affirmatively. For example, I move that we, rather than I move that we do not. And avoid personalities and stay on the subject. You wait for someone to second the motion. That's done by another member to second the motion, or the chair will call for a second if it's not offered automatically. And if there is no second to the motion is lost, and that means there's no further discussion on that particular motion. The chair states the motion. The chair will say, it has been moved and seconded that we, and this is just really good practice for those who aren't actually in attendance and watching, or somebody that hadn't heard what the mover had made his motion about. So chair reinstates it. After the question is stated, the mover can accept an amendment. The membership then either debates the motion or may move directly to a vote. Once the motion is presented to the committee by the chair, it cannot be changed without the consent of the members. Expanding a motion. The time for you to speak in favor of your motion is at this point in time rather than at the time it was presented. So what that means, you wouldn't, I guess, give a reason why you're making your motion and try to state reasons, in favor of your motion. You make the motion, then at that point, you can go on to further why you made that particular motion. And the mover may speak again only after other speakers are finished unless called upon by the chair. And just to be clear about it, when you're explaining your reasons for a motion, if you choose to explain your reason for the motion, which you don't have to, you can't change the motion itself. You're just expanding upon why you made that motion. Then you put the question to the membership. The chair asks, are you ready to vote on the question? If there is no more discussion, a vote is taken. The chair will ask those in favor by saying aye, and those opposed by saying nay. And any member after that time may move for an exact count if they didn't hear clearly who voted in favor of or against a motion. And that's basically the presentation on Robert's Rules of Order 101, but I'm happy to take any questions.
I've got a couple of questions. Okay. Let me kind of dig back here. Okay. On about the third to the last page in the presentation, that's headed with the chair states the motion.
Correct.
Item 2, after the question is stated, the mover can accept an amendment. This may be patently obvious, but I just want to make sure I understand. After the question is stated, does this mean that there's been a motion and a second?
Correct.
And then, as chairman, I would state the motion, in essence, for the benefit of the audience and folks at home. Then we would debate the motion or have the opportunity to discuss the motion.
That's
And
correct.
that's where I often ask, does anyone have any comments? And then if that motion, if folks want to change the motion, the person who made the motion originally, in essence, is accepting or not the amendments.
That's correct.
Okay, okay. I think that's it, actually.
Okay, and again, like I said, you guys do a fabulous job of running this meeting.
There you go, guys.
And I just also wanted to address, I know one of your concerns was training about ethics, and we're going to have follow-up training on that matter.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay,
In the statute or in the ordinance, it says that the planning commission adopts Robert's Rules of Order. So I assume that that was done at some juncture by the planning commission?
that's correct. It's in your bylaws.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, any other questions on this topic? Okay,
Well, thank you.
thank
And
you.
feel free to reach out anytime, and as you know, we're available to assist during the meeting as well if you have a question.
Yeah, and recognize that I reach out with my eyes all the time. Is this what I'm supposed to do?
That's good. I appreciate it.
As do I, thank you. All
So,
right, back.
related to the Planning Commission procedural activities, a couple other questions that have been raised by the Planning Commission were the timing of deliberation and public comment. So, it's appropriate to first have the staff presentation and to ask staff questions, but for the Planning Commission to refrain on providing opinions until after the public hearing, when there's a public hearing component to that agenda item. So allow the public to provide their input, and then the Planning Commission would deliberate. In addition, we wanted to have the conversation with the Planning Commission regarding how we as staff can help improve the staff report so it helps you in your evaluation and deliberation regarding an item. You may have noticed last month we have implemented a red box around proposed motions. We thought this would be helpful to guide the Planning Commission, particularly when you may have an agenda with multiple agenda items, a lot of pages, attachments, so that can be something you can reference back to be able to state the motion you want to make. And obviously that's always subject to the Planning Commission's modifications, but staff wanted to kind of put it in a text box, if you will, to help as a reference point. Certainly, if there are any other suggestions on what we can do to improve the staff reports to, again, help you in your deliberations, this would be an opportunity to discuss that.
Does anyone on the commission have comments, suggestions, questions regarding the staff reports?
Mr. Chairman, my only comment is that Michael and Susan and Tammy, they do an amazing job for us and make our jobs easy. I don't have any additional comments as far as how they could make our jobs any easier. I think they do a phenomenal job.
Thank you. And I would just add to that, those red boxes certainly helped at last month's meeting. You know, I obviously picked up on that, and I'll mirror Nate's comments that you guys do a real nice job, and we do appreciate it, in spite of the whining you may hear from me periodically. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. So, moving on to the next training item, variances. The Planning Commission wanted to have a conversation regarding the standards which are contained within Title 11. These are the standards that the Planning Commission must evaluate and must, as part of their findings, make a determination of whether to recommend approval of a variance request if it meets those standards. And so what we have done is we've put together a PowerPoint presentation that looks at the variance standards for other communities within Nevada as well as state law, so that the Planning Commission would have an opportunity to compare and contrast how other communities handle variances and to answer questions and to receive feedback from the Planning Commission. So before we begin with the review of other communities, I wanted to go back to the training we had in December and just reiterate the 5 conditions contained within 1132.4 of our city code that you review and must determine whether it meets those 5 to grant the variance. And the first, and you'll notice through my presentation, I've highlighted key words which I think kind of drill down to the intent of each of these conditions and standards to kind of help you understand the intent with each of those, both within our code as well as surrounding communities. So we have the 5. The first is that the variance is exceptional or an extraordinary circumstance. In other words, unique, not commonplace. That the variance is necessary for the preservation of the enjoyment of the property owner, and is possessed by other properties within the same area. The third is that granting the variance will not be materially detrimental to the public welfare of surrounding property owners. That's an important one. You'll see a common theme with that throughout the other communities. The fourth, D, that the variance will not be contrary to the comprehensive plan. And I know this has come up with several discussions before, because pretty much variances are not inconsistent with the comprehensive plan, but it is one of the standards within our code. And the final one is that the variance request is not so general or reoccurring to make it practical for the regulations. And my interpretation of this is that if you have a variance that comes up over and over and over again, that's an opportunity to revisit the code and maybe make a determination through a text amendment to modify the regulations, because that variance is being asked so frequently by property owners within the community. So, how do other communities treat variances? First, let's look at state law, NRS 278.300. It talks about the exceptional narrowness, shallowness, shape of a specific property. Again, kind of going back to, is there something unique with this property that makes it difficult to adhere to the regulations of the zoning code? That includes topography conditions and unique conditions of the property. Would it result in an exceptional practical difficulty or undue hardship on the property owner? So that's another consideration from state law. And again, it references that the variance should not be detrimental to the public good of the community and surrounding properties. Looking at Las Vegas. So they provide a summary that in order to grant a variance, it must meet state law, which I just did a brief overview, and the provisions of the subchapter, which are summarized here, that the variance is not available as a use variance. You'll see this as a common theme as well throughout the communities. We don't grant use variations. If a use is not a permitted or conditional use within a zoning district, the recourse is to seek a text amendment to see if that use is appropriate. You don't grant a variance for a particular property within a zoning district and say, well, this use isn't allowed elsewhere within the zoning, but we think it's okay here. That's not permitted either in Las Vegas. That if granted, it would relieve a hardship for that property owner that is not self-created. So we've had some examples over the years here in Boulder City where somebody went and built something, and maybe they knew the regulations, and then they came back and sought a variance after the fact. So similarly here with Las Vegas, that's one of the items that they consider. And then they also state that a variance for a same or similar use granted, and this is interesting, is a factor, but is not to rule out consideration. Meaning that in the case of Las Vegas, even if variances have been granted elsewhere for a similar use, what Las Vegas is saying is that doesn't rule out consideration for that variance. So that's almost kind of an opposite of where Boulder City's standard is. And please stop me if you have any questions along the way, but I'll continue with the presentation. Moving on to Henderson. So they have an overview that say the variances vary from the strict requirements of the development code. They have the development code, we have the zoning code. That they're granted only when necessary to relieve particular and exceptional practical difficulties. So that sounds familiar. Undue hardships resulting in the size, shape, or dimensions of a property. Again, a familiar theme. Topography and other physical conditions. That's what they say warrant consideration of variances. And with their criteria, they have 4. First, that the special circumstances or conditions applicable to the subject property, again, shape, size, topography, warrant the variance. That the variance is not detrimental to the public good and detrimental to surrounding property owners. Third, that granting the variance will not constitute a special privilege inconsistent with the other properties within the vicinity or the zoning district. So granting a variance that provides somebody a benefit that others couldn't benefit from is the intent with number 3 in Henderson. And then 4, granting the variance, again, would not allow a use otherwise prohibited. So, prohibition of use variations. Moving on to North Las Vegas. It talks about variances, again, for setbacks, heights, responding to unique characteristics of the property and topography, and also prohibiting use variations. Doesn't allow for a variance to correct something that's with the zoning. So, their criteria, again, you'll see familiar themes, that there's exceptionary or extraordinary circumstances with the variance request, that the variance is necessary to preserve the enjoyment and the rights of the property owner. And third, that the granting of the variance will not be detrimental to public safety and welfare. Moving on to Reno. City of Reno says that variances are exceptions to their standards intended to alleviate exceptional practical difficulties or undue hardship. They should be extraordinary and exceptional or unique situations. And again, not caused by the applicant. So some common themes there. Their criteria, the property is extraordinary or an exceptional situation. Again, it's because of the physical shape, topography is a reason for the variance. The strict application would not put an undue hardship on the property owner if the variance isn't granted. That it, again, would not be detrimental to surrounding property owners' public health, safety, and welfare, and that the variance is consistent with the title and Chapter 1801 of the Reno Code. And what does that say? It says that the general purpose of this title is to promote the public health, safety, welfare by providing appropriate and reasonable controls for the development and use of lands in Reno while protecting property owner rights. So a couple of staff conclusions after reviewing those examples are that there are similar elements with the other communities' standards for granting a variance to Boulder cities. That all of those communities do not allow for a use variation, and that when granting a variance, you need to make sure that it's not harming the health, safety, and welfare of surrounding property owners. And so we look forward to your questions and discussion.
Well, if I could, and I'm not even quite sure how to start this, but I think where I would like to get to is, I think our variance criteria could use a little bit of updating, especially after having read the state's guidelines. The state's guidelines appear to be pretty focused on recommending that variances would be provided only under quite extraordinary circumstances, and they list them out pretty clearly. And of course, they go through a lot of what we have in our criteria. However, when I compare our criteria, there are a couple in particular, criteria A and B are the first and second criteria that I think open the door fairly widely to us providing variances under really quite a wide variety of circumstances, not necessarily confined to I'll say peculiarities or conditions or topographic conditions. And I would look at the second, such variance is necessary, our second criteria, for the preservation and enjoyment of substantial property right possessed by others in the same vicinity, but it is denied anyway, it goes on, but what I kind of have trouble with is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of a substantial property right. We've certainly seen it argued in the many years I've been doing this, that virtually anything a person wants to do is necessary for their own personal preservation of a property right. They buy a piece of property, it has, we have our city codes, they're applicable to that parcel of property, and the person wants to do something that's kind of, maybe not out of character, but certainly unique, and in some cases we've seen some pretty significant variance requests based on someone's perceived desire to enjoy their property more. I think that criteria should be dropped, and that, I mean, if we want, and I think this is why I'm kind of struggling here, this is my personal opinion. I've heard from another member of the commission that they feel our criteria are lax, if you will, compared to the state's guidelines that were included in this presentation. And I think the question we have to decide as a planning commission and as a community is, do we want to make it somewhat more difficult to get a variance than it is today? In other words, kind of go more towards the intent of the state guidelines, or do we want to leave our terminology as open as it is, so that, basically it's pretty difficult to suggest that a variance is not warranted under the criteria we have today. And I would go to even the first criteria. There are exceptional or extraordinary circumstances or conditions applicable to the property or to its intended use that do not apply generally to the other properties or class of use in the same vicinity. And I kind of struggle with the or its intended use and or classes of use as being a little bit open, and would, again, if it were me, my personal opinion is I think we get put in a position where it's difficult, even though we may not agree with a variance, it's almost difficult to find cause to deny a variance request. If it were me, I would certainly add some of the language that are found in the NRS code relating to reason of exceptional narrowness, shallowness, shape, et cetera, get a little more specific in that first one, even drop the second one. So, all that being said, I think I would like to hear some thoughts from the rest of the commission regarding our variance criteria, whether the rest of the commission feels that I'm on the right track or just out of my mind, or somewhere in between. Nate, you're kind of, okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I am the other commission member that discussed this with Paul a couple of times. And basically what I struggled with was the specificity of the language in statute and how that sort of expands itself within the variance. And also one thing that I was curious about is why there was an omission on natural resources that's explicit in statute as well. And I'm not sure why that was left out. But I guess generally speaking, what we have is a very subjective set of rules, or guidelines for granting the variance. And historically, most do get granted. If you look at go back for 20 or 30 years, that's kind of the case. So it's kind of like, what behooves the community better, to have a very fairly loose and difficult to apply or to try and adhere it more specifically to statute than it already is. And one other thing that I questioned a little bit about, I think it's in there though, is that D directly addresses the comprehensive plan, but the statute itself basically talks about the intent and purpose of any ordinance or resolution. And so it would seem to me that that would have to be a little more encompassing than just the comprehensive plan. So that's my thoughts.
Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman, well, I am on the complete other side of the fence of what you two have discussed. And that is because Boulder City is an extremely unique community. There aren't many cities that were a Federal Reserve, basically master plan to start with, then expanded maybe somewhat haphazardly, and then we incorporated it into a city, and we're operating on different sets of rules during all these different time periods. And now we're going to try to put Boulder City into this tight little perfect box, and it's not going to work, in my mind. And I think that there should be a little bit of some outside the box thinking that we allow for in this code. Variances are there for a reason, because no two properties are exactly the same. Every single property has its own unique legal description, and every single property is a little bit unique to the next, in many different ways. So unless we're building condos, I mean, for example, you're probably not going to get any variances on condos for lot description or for lot size, or it just doesn't exist. If you're building single-family homes in a new community, we're probably not going to get too many variances on that. But Boulder City isn't that anymore, and it probably never was, and that's okay. I just think that keeping the code flexible enough that we can have 7 mines and potentially 12 if it gets appealed and goes to the city council, that we can make educated opinions on what belongs and what doesn't belong. So if we pigeonhole ourselves into a tight little box about what we can and can't approve, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. So,
If I may just kind of, I agree. You know, I agree by and large philosophically with what you're saying. And I'm not suggesting we develop such a tight little box that no one can get in, if you will, or get out, whatever the case would be. But I think what we have in our current criteria is a circumstance, especially with the second criteria, that almost prohibits us from saying no. That's really where my issue is. I feel as though in many years I've been almost put in a position where I could not say, this makes no sense at all, it doesn't fit, and you don't have extraordinary circumstances, even though extraordinary circumstances is in here, when they turn to enjoyment of a substantial property right, then it becomes so subjective as to be almost difficult to vote on. And that's really the one I have heartburn with, and I would like to see that tightened up.
well, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I've been on the commission for 3 years and change, and I can think of a couple instances off the top of my head where we've denied variances. So, I mean, it's not like we haven't done it. And I don't know. I see what you're saying. I don't know how we get there. So if you had some language that you wanted to throw at us for debate, then I'd be interested in hearing that.
You know, I'd like to do that, but I don't have it with me right now. You know, I wanted to kind of first float this balloon to see if there was even any interest in having a further discussion. But anyway, I'm sorry, Matt, please, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Commissioner Lassoff. I think on this subject, I'm a firm believer in the rights of property owners, and I think that we should err on the side of caution. Different planning commissions are going to reflect different degrees of scrutiny, and it's probably due to things change in the community and city councils change and people who are appointed change over the years. My concern is more with enforcement, and that brings up a question that I've wondered for the last couple of years. When, like with the sign ordinance, when a business owner puts up a sign and doesn't pull any permits, and even if it's an electric sign, doesn't pull an electrical permit, does not apply for a variance, and then it's turned over to code enforcement, is it up to the code enforcement officer himself how they remediate that? Do they have to take the sign down? Do they have to modify the sign? Who makes that decision?
So with code enforcement, they respond to the complaints that are received. We look at the code, we consult with other staff internally, and the code enforcement officer is always looking to get the property owner into compliance. And so that is always the objective. And if that requires submitting for a building permit, if that requires a modification, if that requires removal, that's all part of evaluating the code and bringing that property into compliance.
And if the business owner refuses, what is the next step?
The code provides for provisions for citing that property owner for doing work without a permit. Because in essence, most of the work out there requires a building permit. That's where, with the building permit, we determine its compliance with all city codes, including zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Enforcement, yeah. Does anyone else have any comments? Looking at the folks on the phone. Yes, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, this is Ernie Biasi. I'm struggling a little bit with how to do this because this is a very, it's actually a very difficult topic, first of all, because there are so many ways to approach this. I think only because we just talked about the whole issue of, I guess what I'd call the rules and how you, so to speak, enforce them. And the issue I think I was getting from Mr. Lassoff was the issue of trying to have some flexibility in terms of how we look at different projects and things that are done. And the thing I would actually remind us all of is a very simple thing, and that is rules are there largely for consistency, and so that everybody is put on the same playing field, so to speak. And so, in a sense, if you look at, and I'll go back to my history of how documentation is set up. Documentation begins with high-level policy documents, criteria, procedures, detailed steps to follow. So largely what we're talking about, I believe, with this whole variance issue is we've struggled with how do you interpret a lot of these general, what I call general statements that are in there. They're all good statements because, you know, when you're trying to create a top level law or rule, you can't be specific. If you write it too specific, you're either going to ignore a lot of things that you shouldn't have or whatever. And of course, that's where commissions and consuls and, everybody comes into play. They're designed to take those high-level laws and policies and break them down into lower-level specifics. So, in a sense, and this is where I'm not sure if I differ with, and this may be just because I'm struggling with trying to understand over the phone, what Mr. Lazoff is saying, for example, and that is, I think flexibility is not the key. The issue is to determine based on hard criteria. What's a hardship, for example? How does it compare to the zoning issue? What does it do with respect to the owner? Is it creating difficulty that's different because of his location, his setbacks, and all those things? Now, so for example, when I read through, and I thought it was very good to see what Las Vegas, Henderson, North Las Vegas, all those guys are doing. But the one thread I picked up in all of that, there were 2 points. One was the term hardship. And the second piece, there were a lot more specifics in there. Things like they actually talked in some cases to setback, location on property, topography. These are all what I call at a next level of definition of from a high level requirement, which is what our criteria is written around. It's taking it to another level of detail that helps a commission better determine how to allow something. And so there are words. So if I bring it back just to our code or our criteria, I think our criteria tends to be a little too general. It's still written at a little bit too high a level. I would expect our criteria would have stepped it down a little bit from the state criteria and law to a level that helps us, the community and the city personnel, as well as the commission, better interpret how to provide guidance and allow for homeowners requesting the variance. And there's another piece in this that's not talked about that I think we have to talk about, and that is, what about the rights of all the other adjacent people? I don't see that even discussed pointedly in any of this criteria. But when you start talking about hardships, Reno criteria comes the closest in my mind, because it does talk about other property owners, and that is a big deal. Think about it as a commission. Every time we listen to the public, it's basically we're listening to the effects of what a variance is going to do to another property owner. It's not just on the owner that's coming forward with the variance, but it's what's the effect on them. So I'm addressing a lot of points, but I think in one in particular in my mind, I think we have to address the issue of hardships and how it can affect also other property owners. I think the more that we can expand a little bit on and be a little bit more specific on what are some of the general terms that are right now still in our criteria, I think the better we will be. And I think it will make for more consistency of how our commission as well as future commissions operate. Okay, I mean, obviously this is the discussion. It's very difficult to do this over the phone. God knows I wish I was there. It'd be so much easier, but I'll apologize for that. I just couldn't do it. So those are my thoughts. I tried to highlight, if you will, a couple of points that I think are worthy of consideration, and I'll turn it back to the rest of the commission.
Thank you, Commissioner Biaski. Commissioner Rudd, since I can't look at you and see you over there, do you have anything you'd like to add? that might not be fair to just all of a sudden call someone out, so I'll just, if
Been on
anyone.
mute the whole time.
Okay.
I tend to agree with Nate on this. I think that our community is a unique community. You know, by us listening to the public comments, I think that weighs on our decisions. So that's brought into it. If it wasn't, if there was no hardship consideration, we wouldn't have public comment. So I think that weighs on what we're doing.
All right, thank you. Nate, you got your finger poised over the button. Would you like to add?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to, for the record, make sure that Ernie knows that item C directly, I'll just read it verbatim for Ernie's benefit. The granting of such variance will not be materially detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other properties in the area. Ernie, I just want to let you know that's already in our code, that if we grant a variance, it's not going to injure the neighbors. So we're already there.
That one's there.
Well, so, moving forward, that was a good discussion. I really, really enjoyed that. You know, I think Ernie, however, did bring up a good point regarding consistency, and this is where, again, I just go back to my continuous challenge with variances, but maybe it's just me to suggest no if I really feel that way. I would, however, like to, I guess I'm now talking to city staff, is there any way that I could draft something up? Nate kind of suggested, you know, he kind of said, hey, if you think you got something good, something better, put it out there. Is that possible? And maybe I should ask this before we go another moment further. What would it take if we all at this table agreed that language should be adjusted? Maybe not significantly, maybe a few things more significantly, but if we were to feel that changes were made, is that even something that can be done in our city code? And what might the steps be to get there?
That would be proposing a text amendment to that section of the city code to adjust the standards.
Okay. So something we've done many times with regard to other elements of the code.
And Mr. Chairman, just one of the things that I heard about ensuring consistency, and hopefully this component that is put within the staff reports is helpful in that regard. Susan will typically with variances list similar types of variances that have been granted or denied, so that the Planning Commission can understand the kind of the history of that type of variance request. And so if that's helpful to continue to include, or if we can modify that in some way to again provide the Planning Commission with the information that you need so that you can effectively evaluate the variance request.
Right.
I'd like to comment on that because it's actually another point that I had. If it's appropriate at this point, it's really difficult to jump in. But while I agree completely with Mr. Mays is saying, the issue I have also concerns time period. How far back in time should we be going to consider in terms of history what's been allowed? There's a certain point in time, and again, that's not really clear in how our variance is set up, or is there any guidance as to what we consider? Staff does a great job of presenting the information, but the point is now each and every one of us on the commission looks at it and says, well, 10 years ago I had this property that had this setback from the street, or I had, 5 years ago I had this one, or, oh, by the way, this and that. which are all interesting points and obviously have to be taken into consideration. But the reality is we have a code of today, and what we're really trying to figure out is on a setback, what is the real impact on the neighbor, on the public from a standpoint of health, safety, welfare, et cetera. So to me, most of this should be brought forward in time to how it applies now. And now with respect to immediate adjacent owners in the area, and you might extend it out into the zone, but here again, the zone, 2 miles, 3 miles away may not be appropriate. We're talking about the way I read the state code and everything. We're talking about topography and issues related to the immediate area. So I'm not so sure we're as consistent in how we all think and apply our decisions relative to those considerations.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that it'd be nice if we had consistency. The problem is Boulder City as a city doesn't even have consistency. If you take, for example, the Girl Streets, they were built in 2 different periods of time. Some of them have 20-foot side setbacks, and some of them were built with 15-foot side setbacks. And so even in the Girl Streets, there isn't consistency. And so I'm just real fearful that if we modify this code, that we're going to pigeonhole ourselves into a way that it takes the flexibility away from us to actually have human thought. I mean, that's my concern, is we swing the pendulum too far the other way and we just rubber stamp everything no. So.
If I may.
Yeah, but Nate, what you're talking about gets down to, and a good example, you said the Girl Streets. Well, or take the historic district. The short answer is those are unique topographical setback requirements with history that you can base your decisions on. But if I took criteria, let's just say for the setbacks in the historic district or the air square footage issues, and I all of a sudden start applying to lots over the hill, that's not necessarily appropriate. But under unique conditions, it might be. So I come back to, and I guess this is where I'm still at, you really have to look at the specific issues associated with a given piece of property in the specific area they're at, and that's what you use. You don't all of a sudden pull, let's say, a home over the hill and put it back into the criteria from on the other side of the hill or in downtown. It doesn't make sense.
And I agree with you.
So if I could, and I think, item E kind of covers that. And, what I'm suggesting is in no way intended to eliminate thought, deliberation, et cetera, et cetera. You've made a good point. So perhaps you've got homes within one neighborhood that were built at a 15-foot, others with a 20. Well, clearly that would be an opportunity for that property owner with the 20-foot setback to request something similar to what their neighbors have. And I don't think any one of us here now or ever would fault that person. And I certainly wouldn't propose writing criteria that would that would eliminate that. I fully feel that we should have debate over these issues, but I also think that one of these is so wide open that it almost prohibits a denial in many cases. Of course we've denied them, but if you go back and look at the record, you'll see that we approve, I don't know what percentage, probably better than 70%.
I guess my question is there something wrong with approving a variance? I mean, do we have a stigma that approving a variance for somebody to be able to enjoy the property that they want, is there something wrong with that? If it doesn't hurt anybody else, is that bad?
Well, that's a great question. It really is, because I've thought a little bit about that. You know, what are we really suggesting here? You know, what am I thinking? You know, is my thought to just eliminate variances? No, but my thought is that we have codes, and, you know, I moved into this community because I like the community the way it is. You know, I have sat on this planning commission and like the codes more or less as they are, recognizing that there's a lot of, I don't know if the word is discrepancy, but
Ernie,
wait one moment, Ernie.
Okay.
But I think we have codes for a reason. You know, we have, and it's to enjoy the property rights that I have, and my neighbor might propose, in fact has, we've discussed some things that really would require variance, and, you know, I wouldn't be that thrilled about that. You know, and so it goes down to, again, this last criteria, if not so general and recurrent in nature, that it becomes a de facto code amendment, you know? And that would be one thing I would like to either, I think we need to kind of man up, if you will, no offense, but, and say, hey, we want codes to be different, and we can put variance criteria in that will help us make decisions every time a variance comes before us. Going back to the consistency matter that Ernie has mentioned. I mean, that's really where I'm at, is I would like to be able to say, okay, yeah, this really does fall within that, I'm good with it, move on, give the variance and go forward. This one doesn't. Let's, you know, my opinion would be deny, you know, that kind of thing. That's it. Ernie?
Well, I think, and again, I'm trying to get to an answer because, you know, obviously discussion is really what we're doing right now. But I think what, of course, we need to provide to staff is what do we do? And, you know, I can say, first of all, I think the first and foremost thing, and I still remember what Susan taught me when I first came on the commission and emphasized, was variances are for our approval and they're for technical compliance. Now, there are criteria which, of course, as presented, address what should we consider. So I bring it back to the criteria. Obviously, we are trying to make it so that the property owner that's coming with that variance has every right to try to enjoy his property to the fullest. And I completely support that. What I'm also trying to say, though, is, and I think where I believe we need to do, is to either pick a few different words and or create a more of a code language. I hate to use it, but let's just say, if I use the analogy to code, if I put in a little more specifics, like under the use code. So under use code, you can define a general area of what's allowed for an R1 zone that might include some level of commercial, but at the same token, you put some words in there that kind of help define it. Well, the same goes for variances. You know, what are some of the real considerations? North Las Vegas or Henderson did a good job and said setbacks, location on property, topography. Those are much better words in terms of giving guidance to the commission of how to interpret whether to allow the variance. And again, the variance is a technically specific thing. This isn't here about just make a, you know, come be odd, make everybody happy. It's about doing the right thing for property owners adjacent to or in the neighbor, as well as the owner himself. So where I'm going with maybe my points are, because we could go on, and I could debate this all day, and that is, I think we just need some more specific language, not necessarily so much in the current criteria. I think a few choice words could be made differently, but I think the primary thing is maybe we need a little supplemental language, almost like guideline document to it. That's where I'm headed.
So we've had quite a discussion, and I don't think we're all as far removed from one perspective as one might think. You know, we are all property owners, I suspect, and I would like to do what I want to do with my property. I'd like to be able to apply for a variance, but anyway, you know, I would like to somehow bring forward some language that would at least be a straw person for everyone to look at. And perhaps that language would just be intolerable. Perhaps it would be acceptable, or portions of it. So I'd like to do that. And so I would need city staff to help me understand how I might draft something up, share it with the commission, with city staff, the commission, that sort of thing. So that we can either say, hey, you know what, some of that makes sense, or let's just drop it all together and stay right where we are, you know? How might we do that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, certainly the intent for tonight was to have a conversation, to raise understanding among the Planning Commission members on the purpose of the variance standards, look at best practices with respect to other communities to give ideas. What you're suggesting would obviously require a separate agenda item, and what I can do is I can research how that would be accomplished. Just without looking at the code, it would be probably an agendized item where the Planning Commission would be asking for a text amendment to be considered and providing direction on that. So I can certainly research that and follow up.
All right, thank you.
I have a question. Well, it goes back to what I asked before, Michael. Do you know why relative to the statute, those categories of dimensions, shallowness, narrow, topography, why those aren't in the criteria? And secondly, why in statute it speaks to the natural resources, and why those things aren't included in the criteria?
And I don't have an answer as to the origin of the standards, and what I can do is try to research that when these standards were put in place, and if there's any information as to why these and other things weren't taken into consideration.
I'm going to be blunt. I think that's a waste of time. I mean, partly what the discussion is about, even what I've raised, and I think what is also being discussed right now, is we are raising the question regarding, here's what's in a couple of the other criteria documents or guidelines or that are in some of the other cities, and that's all we're saying. Why aren't we perhaps being a little more specific in terms of addressing those? I don't need necessarily the history, because you're not going to get a history beyond they're just responding to a very high level state requirement, which is how you set up documentation. The whole country is based off of high-level laws broken down into lower-level stuff with more detail at each level. And that's actually all I'm saying is we need maybe a little bit different language, which is what I think perhaps staff could do, listening to perhaps comments and looking at the practices that you've presented. What do you think? Should there be some words that we could change that would help the commission better do their job? And also, and I'll say it again as I probably tried to say, is that maybe there's also a supplementary document that could actually expound on that a little bit more. I know in other communities that I've served on planning commissions, we had things like design guideline documents when it came to architectural stuff. And those design guideline documents provided guidance, which is really, I'm not sure it's appropriate here, but what I'm trying to say is they provided additional information to help at a working level. And that's really what we're talking about, guys. This is about us as a commission to be functional at a working level, and where we can, whether it's me gone tomorrow and someone else replacing me, being able to step in and be able to clearly see what they're supposed to do. Because right now it's just, the whole purpose of this whole discussion was to try to get a little more clarity to help us better understand how to apply a variance.
I have a
My
question. Have a question for Ernie. The reason in the statute, it defines the categories of narrowness and shallowness and shape, and those were things that you had mentioned previously, and I'm wondering why that's not a factor then.
If you're asking why I think it's a factor, I think those tend to be a lot more specific in terms of how we interpret essentially what we're trying to do in terms of accepting a variance. That's all.
So you would say that would be a subordinate thing to the criteria itself, then?
I'm saying that the criteria is probably as stated, using terms like narrowness, location, and whatever, and then that's a lot more specific for you or I to then be able to then consider how does that affect the owner's property rights, and how does it affect adjacent owners, in terms of where that position is on the lock and how close it is to the property line. That's all. This is a tough one, but I think the whole reason behind all this discussion was how do we get more clarity for us as members to be able to do our job without just leaving it totally, well, we need to be flexible and we just let it, rule on everyone on its own merit, that's not saying you shouldn't do that. I mean, everyone is its own merit, but at the same token, you should be doing it with respect to the criteria that the city has defined because it affects everybody so that there's consistency.
All right, why don't we wrap the discussion?
I don't know if that answers it. I'm repeating myself, and I really don't need to say anything more, so I'm going to kind of try to shut up. I apologize for talking too much. All right, well, I want to say thank you to all the commissioners for their insights, thoughts. How do we close this item and move on to the monthly report on development allotments?
Certainly the agenda item does state, for possible action. If you wanted staff to come back with some suggestions based on this feedback, that could be a direction to staff, and then we could agendize for something like that if there is a preference by the Planning Commission to do so.
Well, I would like to see, I think you've heard the comments. I think they've been recorded, and you could take those I mean, my recommendation, or so perhaps this would be a motion, just simply asking staff to, at some future meeting, present some revisions to the language as they see fit based on the thoughts that were expressed here tonight, and the concerns about making changes that were expressed here. And we could then take a look at those and up, down, or add comments to them. And I think I need to present that as a motion. Am I correct in that?
Correct.
All right. I would make a motion that staff, based on comments provided here tonight, provide some draft language to modify existing criteria to, I'm just going to say based on our comments, and to bring them to a future meeting as an agenda item. Do we have a second on that?
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. Any comments? If not, take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed?
Nay.
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 Okay, we have a tie vote.
With a tie vote, no action then.
Oh, okay, so it
Right.
falls. Okay. All right, well, sorry to take so much of your time. But it was indeed. All right. Progress report on development allotments.
Provided no additional report.
All right. And we have a final public comment period. Once again, due to the delay, we'll give 45 seconds, provide 45 seconds for call-in.
And
Start.
potential audience.
And audience, do we have any public comments from the audience?
Good afternoon, Planning Commission members. I'm Taylor Tedder, your city manager. I've met a couple of you before, so it's nice to see you again. I'm making my way around to the various boards and commissions and committees in the city. And I just wanted to come here today to express my appreciation to you for your time and effort that you spend on your business here. Planning commissions are often regarded as one of the most important boards and commissions in city governments, second to the city council. Just don't tell the other boards and commissions that. But it's really through the positive impacts that you make on the community through your recommendations and action here. So thanks again for all that you do, and I'm always happy to make myself available if you need anything. So have a great evening.
Thanks.
Thank you. If anyone that perhaps is live streaming this meeting wishes to call in, the number is 702-589-9629, and we'll delay for 45 seconds. Hearing no comments, we'll bring that public comment period to a close. And hereby close the meeting of March 16th. Make sure I've got the right date, of the City Planning Commission meeting. Thank you.